Can everyone hear me fine? People in the back? Am I projecting? Okay, good. So yes, I've titled this talk Mental Trauma and the Threat of Hell, Finding Healing on a Historical Tour of the Afterlife. However, I'm not going to really talk about trauma until towards the end. A lot of it will be very much data because I am a scientist, and so that is what I do, is I analyze data. So disclosures, ideas are here represent my own and no one else. And if I'm citing sources, that does not necessarily mean that I agree with everything that is in those sources. So my research motivation is that there are people who have experienced mental trauma related to the concept of hell. And so a very important step for many of those people is to dismantle some toxic concepts that they may have. And often a very important step for that is a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the historical development of various different concepts of hell. And this is just based upon my own personal experience as well as the experiences of other people. So the methodology that I adopt is the standard within the field of academic biblical studies. It's known as the historical critical method, meaning that the meaning of texts is determined by the original historical, social, literary, and linguistic context of these texts. I like to summarize it as data over dogma, because that's what scientists do, right? And what that means is that church tradition and mythology, later theologians, etc., are not part of the original context and thus do not contribute to what our original authors were trying to say. It is possible that later traditions may preserve something that is earlier. However, later texts cannot be used to prove that those ideas or beliefs existed in the actual time period. So this is a foundational concept to all research that is done, and so if anyone has any questions, now is a good time, because this is the like basis of like everything. So 3, 2, 1, okay. Yes.
Can you assume a divine author of the scriptures?
Yes. So the historical critical method just says that the meaning of texts are determined by their original historical context. For someone who says that yes, there is a divine author, that divine author chose to speak through these historical, social, literary, and diverse contexts. So those two are not things that are butting up against each other. Good, we're good? All right. So a little bit of historical background. I'm going to start with the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian Old Testament, and its ancient West Asian sources. So we're talking about the first millennium BCE. And then I will skip ahead to the New Testament, which is in the late 1st century CE. And the appropriate context for understanding the New Testament is known as early Judaism, which is this time period that is between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And there are various texts that were composed during this time period. I've listed several of those treasure troves of data that we'll be looking at later. So I organized this talk according to 3 research gaps that are important for understanding the historical development of various concepts of the afterlife, going from the Hebrew Bible and then proceeding forward. So if you read through the academic secondary texts on what is the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, you will often hear it said that there is no heaven and there is no hell in the Hebrew Bible. That, I would say, is probably the dominant point of view among most critical scholars. However, that point of view has been challenged within, I'd say, the last 25 to 30 years of research. And so my first research gap is there no quote-unquote hell in the Hebrew Bible? That's not entirely true. However, it is true that the bad afterlife that we find in the Hebrew Bible looks nothing like the hell that most Western Christians think about. And so first I will show you this is ancient Israel and Judah over here, and then ancient West Asia. This just refers to broadly all of the surrounding cultures around ancient Israel, which includes ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, as well as the Hittites over here and the Canaanites, which are north. So for pre-scientific ancient West Asian people, the deceased's memory amongst their living kin, friends, as well as deities is what sustains the spirit of the deceased in the underworld. And so within ancient Israelite culture, there are several mechanisms for how to preserve the memory of a deceased person. And these include proper burial and funerary rites, invoking the name of the deceased person, as well as ongoing post-mortem care via food and drink offerings that are usually provided by offspring. I do want to clarify this practice that scholars call caring for the dead is distinct from necromancy. And if you want a long discussion of that, you can check out this PhD thesis that came out of Brown in 2017. The one other mechanism for how to preserve someone's memory beyond death is the setting up of memorial steles or monuments for the deceased, as well as written texts. So either the deceased person or someone else can write text that preserves someone's memory beyond death. And so the deprivation of these conditions endangers the deceased to restlessness, isolation from their kin and friends, and eventually they cease to exist completely in the afterlife. And so for those who are more graphically inclined, this is a figure that I've taken out of a research paper that came out in 2019 in Vetus Testamentum, which is a top journal of, for the Old Testament. And as you can see, proper burial, care by someone's offspring, their memory is carried on, leads to a good death and a restful afterlife, whereas deprivation of burial and the erasure of someone's memory leads to a bad death, restlessness, and eventually their spirit fades out. And so when we look in our ancient West Asian sources, this rhetoric of death desecration, so I'm using that term just to refer to anything that would try to erase someone's memory. This rhetoric, if we read through our ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite sources, it becomes a metonymy for a bad afterlife fate. If you remember from your high school English class, a metonymy is a literary device whereby two things that are closely associated, one of them can become a stand-in for the other. And so if you're reading through the ancient West Asian sources, and you're reading through some curse, and it says, may your body not be buried, and may you not have offspring. What it's really saying is, may your spirit be restless in the afterlife. So I've collected two representative data points, but there are literally thousands of ancient texts, as well as things that have been discovered within ancient West Asia that help us to reconstruct this worldview. And so this is a curse written on an ancient Egyptian monument from over 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And it is a curse against someone who would try to damage this monument and thus violate someone's memory. And so this is how the curse goes. It says, he will not be buried in the West, which refers to the underworld, and their flesh shall burn together with that of the criminals. They haven't been turned into ones who do not exist, so they would get fading out completely. He shall be an enemy of the glorified spirits. His memory shall not be among those living on earth. Water shall not be poured out for him. Offerings shall not be given to him. So this text is very crucial because we're finding all those different concepts that have been gathered together into this one text, and that's why that I chose to show this text. So the second text that I chose comes out of Mesopotamia from the early 1st millennium BCE, which is roughly contemporaneous with the formation of ancient Israel. And this is the Maklu series of incantations against witches. And so the whole entire logic of this text is these are spells that people would use against people who are practicing witchcraft for evil purposes. And the whole entire point is to destroy the ghost of this witch so that she can't strike out from beyond the grave. And so here we have it. May eagle and vulture prey on your corpse. May dogs tear apart your flesh. May your smoke, which is the destroyed ghost, rise ever heavenward. May the sun extinguish your embers. May the son of Ea, who is a god, the exorcist, cut off your emanations. And so Dr. Abush, who specializes in research in ancient Mesopotamian magic, he helps to clarify that the whole entire logic of this is that by depriving someone of burial, their body is destroyed, and her ghost is no more. So what about the Hebrew Bible? Do we have any examples of this rhetoric of death, desecration in the Hebrew Bible? And it turns out that we have many examples. So one of the more well-known ones comes out of an oracle that Jeremiah pronounced against Judahites. So these Judahites who are living in ancient Jerusalem, they were going down into this valley known as the Valley of Gehinnom, and they were sacrificing their own children to a Canaanite deity, Molech. And so this deity is associated with the underworld, and so they're going down into this valley to perform human sacrifice. And so God is very angry about this, and so he is pronouncing this curse against these people. And what does he say? He says, and the dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the air and for the beasts of the earth, and none will frighten them away. And if we go on, all the bones of these people, they shall be brought out of their tombs, and they shall be spread before the sun, and they shall not be gathered or buried. And so these egregiously bad Judahites who are practicing human sacrifice, they are sentenced to die in the netherworld, i.e. Gehinnom, and have their spirits consigned to restlessness and to eventually fade out. The second example that I've chosen comes out of Isaiah 66. This text seems to look forward to when the earth is renewed by God. And this concept is represented by the rhetoric of having someone's memory carried on. And so he says, God is speaking to those who are faithful to him. He says, so shall your offspring and your name remain. But in contrast, those who have rebelled against him, those who are righteous, they're gathering in the New Jerusalem, and they're looking out, and what do they see? They shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. So here, once again, we have deprivation of burial as well as burning of corpses, which this sounds very similar to what we just saw, right, in the Maklu series of incantations. So this is a little map. So Isaiah 66 specifies that there are people who are presumably turning towards God, and they are gathering to Mount Zion, which is in Jerusalem. If you are gathering into Mount Zion and you are looking out on those corpses, where are the corpses? Based on this map, they are in the valley of Gehinnom, that exact same valley that is associated with the underworld and where the ancient Israelites, or at least some of them, were sacrificing their own children. So beyond this use of the rhetoric of preserving someone's memory beyond death, we also have other texts where God is portrayed as a beneficent character. His neighbors, who is named, he is poor, he is homeless, and he is sickly, and he is living at the rich man's gate. Both men die, but in the afterlife, we see a reversal of fates. Lazarus is comforted at quote-unquote Abraham's side, or Abraham's bosom, as it's sometimes known, there is this deep chasm that separates him from his former neighbor within life, the rich man who is, in quote unquote, he's suffering in the flames of Hades, which equals essentially the netherworld. The rich man calls out across this chasm to Abraham, and he wants him to command Lazarus to dip his finger in cool water to cool the rich man's burning tongue. And he is denied because of the chasm. And it is also stated, basically, you had your good things within life. The rich man's second request is to once again to send Lazarus to warn his brothers who are still living about the judgment, essentially. And this request is also not accepted. And the rationale that Abraham gives is that because if they do not respond to the ethical admonitions of the Hebrew Bible, they will not turn, even if someone rises from the dead. And so I've included several important things that I've noticed. And one is that the condition of the rich man in Hades is never said to be without end. And furthermore, the parable does not state that these two fates are the only possible two afterlife fates. In thinking about this particular text, I think that this parable functions somewhat like a Broadway musical. It does not make any literal sense. After all, someone who is literally being burned is not going to go and give a very elaborate monologue about their suffering and about making all of these, artful dialogue. And so kind of like in a Broadway musical, where we as the audience, even though we might see people breaking out in coordinated singing and dancing, we are able to suspend our disbelief because we understand that this part is an aspect of storytelling and literary artistry. What about the anguish of the rich man? It seems to be his regret over his life choices, as well as his resentment and a continued desire to dominate those who he considers vulnerable and worthless, i.e. the poor Lazarus. And so I would say that the rich man's only anguish is self-induced. So what about the afterlife imagery within this parable? Do we have any precedents within our early Jewish sources? And it turns out that we do, if we go back in time to the 3rd century BCE, the Book of the Watchers, which is part of 1st Enoch. And here, once again, this figure Enoch, he is journeying to the abodes of the dead, and he actually sees 4 different afterlife fates. One of them is for those who are righteous, and they have a restful afterlife with a spring of water as well as light. So recall that the rich man who was suffering within Hades, what did he ask from the poor man? He asked for water, right? Where does that concept or that image come from, right? It seems kind of random to us, but this is the only early Jewish text that I know of where this concept is shown. If we proceed to this bottom category, there is another category for those who are considered sinners, but who were so egregiously bad that they did not receive what was their due within life, and they are said to experience torment. However, there are also 2 more categories. There is one category for those who were wrongfully slain, and they are calling out for the vengeance on those who had killed them. There is also one more category for those who are said to be quote unquote godless. They do not care about God or about doing right things, but nevertheless they had received their due within life, and so there is no punishment beyond death for them because they have already gotten it. Enoch is also told by his guide, who is one of the angels who is with him, about the final judgment, which is at the end of a time. And elsewhere within the Book of the Watchers, it is clarified that the righteous are eventually raised to eternal life, and those who are in the egregiously bad category, they are raised, they are judged, and they perish. Those who are in this category are said, there is no punishment, but they are also not raised to a final judgment. And in those who are in this category, we simply are not told anything. Is there any other evidence for a partial resurrection within any of our texts that are canonical to Christians? And it turns out that there is. In Daniel, which its final form dates to about the 2nd century BCE, and is one of our earliest texts that mentions a bodily resurrection. It's roughly contemporaneous with our Enoch texts. It goes like this: and many, but not all, of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Which this word that is translated, it is only used 2 times in the entire Hebrew Bible, here and in Isaiah 66, where it refers to the abhorrence of the exposed corpses in Isaiah 66. So notice, only those who are the quote-unquote wise, so those who are presumably loyal to God, and the egregiously bad seem to be raised. The fate of everyone else is simply not stated. What about within Luke's gospel? Is there any data that we could look at for a partial and not a universal raising of the dead at the final judgment? Jesus is disputing with the Sadducees, which was a Jewish sect that did not believe in the resurrection for the righteous, for the wicked. No one gets raised. And so Jesus is arguing with them, and this is what he says. He says, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. They cannot die because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. However, did you notice that this statement implies that there are at least some people who are not found worthy of the resurrection, and thus will not be raised for the final judgment. For the sake of time, I think I will skip ahead to the lake of fire and the second death, so if y'all could skip down to that part of your handout with me. Revelation is the final book of the New Testament and the canonical Christian Bible. And so we have a great dragon, which is Satan, and he summons a beast and a false prophet out of a chaotic sea. This evil trio, they are persecuting those who are following Jesus, and this evil trio and their hordes are eventually vanquished. They are eventually cast into a lake of fire to be tormented day and night, quote unquote, forever and ever, which I think a better translation would be on and on, which I can talk about. Personified death and Hades, which refers to the underworld, are also cast into the lake of fire. And finally, the dead are raised for judgment according to deeds that are written within books, and those whose names are not found written in the book of life are cast into the lake of fire, which equals the second death. So a logical question to ask about the lake of fire and the second death is, what is the end result of the lake of fire and the second death? If we read on a mere 4 verses after Revelation chapter 20, I think we find a pretty clear response to this question. And it goes like this. So he, God, will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. And so if this statement is actually true, then what happened to death when it was cast into the lake of a fire? Death was destroyed in the lake of fire, along with Satan, demons, the beasts, and anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life. If we continue to the last chapter of the New Testament, we have one more final metaphor that is used. And so, once again, those who are presumably loyal to God are gathering into the New Jerusalem, but outside of the New Jerusalem are the dogs, which seems to be a metaphor for egregiously bad people, and sorcerers, and the sexually immoral, and murderers, and idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. And so those whose names were not found written in the book of life, if they have already been wiped out in the lake of fire, why are they being described as quote-unquote out of the New Jerusalem? Right? This could be a potential critique, right? However, if we think about Isaiah 66, what happened to those who were shut out from the New Jerusalem? What did they see? Did they see people being graphically tormented? No. What they saw was dead corpses, right? Which I would argue that Revelation 22 is recycling the imagery that we saw in Isaiah 66. So, if this is true, and that we don't have endless suffering in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament, where does the idea of endless suffering come from then? And I would agree with, I kind of like Dr. Ehrman's statement that hell is Hellenistic. And so what does he mean by that? So during the Second Temple period, the Greeks came to dominate most of the known world, and this happened in the latter 4th century BCE. And so in this map, you see the conquest of Alexander, and if you notice that Jerusalem is included amongst all of his conquests, as well as all the Jews who were living in various places here. And so what that means is that Hellenistic culture was coming into contact with Jews, and they came to be influenced by Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek religion. So I have made a heat map of different concepts of hell within early Jewish texts, and I've ordered them chronologically. So going from the Book of the Watchers in the 3rd century BCE, and then proceeding down to the latter 2nd century CE. And the ones that are labeled in green, I would classify them as those who are in quote-unquote hell, cease to be, essentially. The orange, I think it's not entirely clear. And the red, I would say that yes, this is a positive control for endless suffering, which, if you notice, there's only one text that I have highlighted, right? And that is 4th Maccabees, which is in the latter 1st century CE. So remember that Alexander the Great, he comes to dominate most of the known world in the 4th century BCE, but we aren't seeing anything that is approximating the idea of endless suffering until after that. So for endless suffering to be a coherent concept, one must assume that the body or the soul cannot die, which, as I have argued, is not a view found in the Hebrew Bible. The idea that the soul cannot die is a Hellenistic one, coming out of Greek philosophers like Plato, which these concepts were spreading after the conquest of Alexander in the 4th century BCE. Our earliest Jewish and Christian sources, which attest to this concept of endless suffering, as well as graphic descriptions of people suffering within hell, show signs of Hellenistic like concepts, basically. So 2 examples. One is in the 4th Maccabees, which, if you remember, was my positive control for endless suffering. That within 4th Maccabees, there is no bodily resurrection mentioned. The entire focus is that souls are inherently cannot die, and so either they will exist within bliss or within suffering. The second example, which I personally noticed this, was that within the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, which dates to the late 1st century CE, perhaps the early 2nd century CE, the description of the punishing angels within hell is strikingly similar to the description of the Furies within Greek myth, which, if you remember, the Furies within Greek myth torture those graphically in the Greek fields of punishment. And so these punishing angels in the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, they are described as having feminine features. They wield whips, and most strikingly, blood drips down from their eyes, which are all elements that we find in descriptions of the Furies. So far, we have not seen anything that approximates our modern Western typical concepts about hell, right? Thinking about maybe like medieval church paintings of like people suffering within horrible ways. Where does all that imagery come from? If it doesn't come out of the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, or even many of our early Jewish sources, where does it come from? And for that, we have to look beyond the New Testament into another genre of ancient texts known as the early Christian tours of hell, which include graphic descriptions of imprisonment and torture that fit within the milieu of the Roman Empire. And the particular sins that are targeted vary according to their social context. And so, for example, the Apocalypse of Peter, which dates to the 2nd century CE, lists punishments for those who are worshiping idols as well as those who are persecuting Christians. And so we see here a very clear concept of vengeance. And we actually see this within some of our early Christian texts, is basically, if you burn us at the stake, may you be burned forever. The Apocalypse of Paul, which dates to the 4th or perhaps 5th century CE, lacks these groups of sinners. So you don't have people who are worshiping idols, and you don't have those who are persecuting Christians, but now you have those who are heretics and corrupt clergy. And so now we see the hell is being weaponized as a tool for social control. And so how do we explain this change in focus upon the particular people that are targeted within these texts? And the change in focus is explained by how Christianity is becoming dominant in the Roman context. So in the 2nd century CE, Christians are a minority and they are not within power, and so they are being persecuted for their faith. But if you fast forward to the 4th and the 5th century CE, now it is Christians who are the ones who are the movers and shakers, so to speak. And as Dr. Henning mentions in her 2021 book, that the particular types of punishment, as well as the logic of how people thought that the punishment must quote unquote fit the crime, that these concepts are very much concepts within the Roman system of crime and punishment. It does not look anything like Jesus' command to love those who who wrong you. It's about vengeance. And so I don't want to traumatize people with details from these texts, but if you are wanting to know more, I put up some useful research that people have done on this genre. So as we kind of regroup, I do have a tentative proposed model of the afterlife based upon all the data that we disembodied existence beyond death for those who are loyal to to God, as well as for the vulnerable dead. And I've listed down there several people who I think might fit that category. I also feel that the texts are quite clear. Oh wait, hold on, let me go back. Those who are in the positive existence beyond death, I do think that God will remember those who are in this category, and thus He will sustain them all the way until the final judgment, where they will be raised to a new resurrection body. I also feel quite confident that there is a retribution for those who are egregiously bad, essentially, and that once they have gotten what they deserve, they will fade out completely, as per our ancient West Asian sources. But that as per our early Jewish sources, I do think that there will be a resurrection to basically see the end game switch to, and then also this is actually a kind of a theme within some of our early Jewish texts, is that those who had persecuted and wronged those who were weak, they are forced to see the people that they had wronged, and to see that those people, that they are being raised to everlasting life as they fade out. I'm not sure if there's a category for those who are wrongfully killed, and we also aren't told anything about their fate at the final judgment. I do feel quite confident that there is another category, the godless who do not get what who did get what they deserved within life, and thus are not worthy of any additional punishment beyond death. However, I don't think that it is entirely clear what happens to people who are in this group. If they are remembered beyond death, I do feel quite confidently they will have a restful existence beyond death. However, if they are forgotten completely, do they just fade out, or what ends up happening? Are they able to change their minds and perhaps transfer from this category up to this category, or perhaps to be raised? Our texts do not say so, but they also do not deny this. However, I do think that if someone is in this category all the way to the final judgment, they will not be raised because they have already received what they deserved within life. And so the significance and the innovation of my proposed model, the significance for those who have experienced trauma related to conceptions of the afterlife, I think the most important one is that hell rhetoric is not directed at victims of afterlife related trauma. The pastoral importance is that it helps to alleviate the emotional distress that this horrible concept can have upon people. The philosophical importance is that it helps to redress a very important philosophical problem of how could making someone suffer without end fit with the wrongs that were committed within one finite life. What is new about my model is that it integrates emerging research on ancient Israelite as well as early Jewish concepts into the model. And what is something that is conceptually new is the evidence for greater than 2 possible afterlife fates. And here I just have one slide for those who may be facing or perhaps helping someone that they care about through fears that are related to concepts of post-mortem suffering. And one is to set healthy boundaries with people about the subject. From my personal experience, this is not something that will be resolved within mere weeks or a month. To avoid contexts where people weaponize the concept of hell to control and to abuse people, despite there being pressure to go, either for the sake of satisfying those who are trying to get them to go, or for avoiding hell. I think what is more productive is to connect with people who have similar experience, as well as people of faith and perhaps not of faith who are loving and open-minded. And as for me, as a person who likes to research in this area, probably the most important thing to helping someone move past the trauma that is related to this is to educate yourself about the history of hell and to critically think about statements um, about what it is. And I do underline critically evaluating, because so often people just blindly accept whatever someone else tells them and aren't actually thinking, does this concept that this person is telling me, does it fit the actual historical data that we have? And finally, working with a mental health professional may be needed within certain cases to address the physiological responses to trauma. For the sake of time, I think that I will skip my future research directions. We can talk about it, people care. And with that, I'll give my acknowledgments. First of all, to my, as well as Ratio Christi for hosting me, and finally, all of the researchers here. And with that, I'll take any questions that you guys have.
So we have about 15 minutes or so at 9:45. That's when we'll leave and go to the Chick-fil-A area and just hang out there. I am going to ask, if I've talked to you about the 10-second rule, please impose that now, Sam and others. So we want to make sure that everyone has enough time to talk with Joshua. Although, yeah, like Joshua said, don't blindly accept what someone tells you, right?
Exactly.
We'll go till about 9:45.
Sam.
Are there limits on what I can do with my remains, i.e., can I take my ashes and have them turned into diamonds?
All right, so that is a very fascinating question. So here, it isn't possible for me to get into all the details about how did ancient people think about this, right? Because you can probably think of many life circumstances where someone's body is slain on the battlefield and you can't give it proper burial rites. What are the backup mechanisms, right? And all I can tell you is that as we read through our ancient West Asian sources, there are many different mechanisms that are backup mechanisms. So as long as you preserve someone's memory beyond death, that is what matters. And so there are examples of what you said, where I don't know if you remember in 2 Samuel, Saul, he is killed on the battlefield by the Philistines, and they take his corpse and they nail it into this temple for Dagon. But then this group of people from Gilead, Saul had to help them, and so they fight their way into this temple, take Saul's corpse, bring it back, but then they also cremate it. And so cremation is not inherently something that is an act of desecration. It is about what is the intent. And so for them, cremation was actually an act of preserving Saul's memory and those of his sons beyond death. And so in that context, cremating someone is actually positive. And so it's all about context, about as long as you are preserving someone's memory beyond death, they will live on.
Why does it matter if you're being remembered beyond death if God will remember you for your loyalty?
Yes, so that is a very fascinating question, and I've been thinking about this a lot, because there are certain texts where people are worried about being remembered, but they are also worshiping God. And so for me, as a modern Westerner, that seems very odd to me, because my intuition is I kind of like yours, where it's well, God's going to remember you anyway, so why are you worried about whether or not you have kids, right? But for the biblical writers, what I'm kind of toying with is that for ancient people, this is like science to them. And so for God to intervene, it is still something that is extraordinary and special to them. And so that's why that they still take great care to preserve their memory beyond death. And so one example that I can give to you is the whole entire story of Ruth is framed by this whole entire concept, because she loses all of her family, right? And then she's devastated. She doesn't have any children, and the whole entire story is about how Ruth is able to marry Boaz and have a child who will preserve the memory of all those who were killed. But yeah, that is a very complicated question, and I'm still looking at it.
Can you discuss the paradise concept of like Jesus with the guy on the cross, and he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." I think you really does that fit within your model of a story?
Yes. So in First Enoch, that would be this blue category. So, but that is a very interesting text because do you remember what does the thief on the cross ask from Jesus? What does he say? Remember me, right? Which like I was blown away by that when I like read it because I was like, what? I had never noticed that. But I mean, what he asked Jesus is to remember me beyond death, and Jesus' response is, today you'll be with me in paradise because I'll always remember you, right? Anyone else?
Yeah, and like it talks about the different people, the different lashes. I think it's I don't remember which book it's from, but like does that fit down like there with the really bad sinners, like being like the part of the judgment?
The whips, you mean?
Like there'll be greater lashes for.
Oh, beaten. Yeah. So that one is interesting because within that text, or that is a parable of Jesus. Of like there is someone who is really bad. He is a manager for his master, and he's abusing people. And that person is actually cut into pieces, which is interesting, right? Because just cutting up someone's corpse, right? I would place that person into the orange category. But then there are also other people who are not as bad, and those who are still getting some kind of like retribution, like you mentioned. That is interesting. I have not thought about that text quite as much about where it might fit in here, because within that one, I think that those servants, they're still construed as like being loyal to the master in some way, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I need to think about that on text too. Anyone else who has not asked a question?
So your model provides this explanation where the mentally ill are sort of seen as the vulnerable dead, and they have a restful afterlife. Yet you can look at the concept where it's like people who act in very egregious ways are sentenced to this sort of annihilation, and they have this restless afterlife. So would there be some sort of overlap to where you could say that the people who did these egregious things were mentally ill, therefore they deserve to be seen as vulnerably dead and not?
Yeah, so that is very difficult because for our ancient sources, they didn't have really like their concept of mental illness is far more blurry compared to our modern Western scientific of like we can say that this is a certain mental illness and we have molecular mechanisms of this is why it happens, right? Whereas for ancient people, they're just seeing all these symptoms, and so I think it's very difficult for us as modern people to like try to impose that onto the way ancient people thought. But this is kind of my like thinking of like this is a possible mechanism for on what basis could God save someone who has a mental illness? Because like I've interacted with people who they cannot believe because they don't have the actual mental faculties to, right? And it wasn't through some fault of their own. But with this model, those who don't have those like faculties, and the example that I gave was a child, that apparently God can just step in and say, I'm going to remember you anyway. And he can just do that.
I guess like how do you think about you talk about like this stuff has these Hellenistic influences and things like that. I guess is that supposed to things like the eternal soul type stuff? Is that supposed to tell me it's false, or I guess like how do you think of that as far as just like the Bible doesn't seem to directly tell me like a theory of personal identity or philosophy of mind like.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess like the fact that it's influenced from Greek philosophy doesn't seem to really tell me obviously one way or the other like if it's false, or do you think like some of those ideas
Yes. So I think that here, the like question is that for me, as like a person of faith, is did Jesus think that the soul can intrinsically last forever? And I find that very difficult because of some other texts that I didn't have time to like talk about, but like Matthew 10:28, where Jesus says like, "Fear him who can not only kill the body but can also kill the soul." Right? I mean, of course, people debate that, but I can show you texts, which I have backup slides, where people did have a concept that souls can die. And we have evidence in First Enoch and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I could just go on and on and on and on and on and say, we have a lot of data. And so I can use all that data to try to reconstruct, well, where does Jesus fit within the spectrum of Second Temple Judaism? I can tell you that that a lot of people who are doing research on this, they will say, and one person you can look at and two is Dr. Boccaccini, who's at the University of Michigan. He argues that Jesus and his earliest followers are an outgrowth of the original like Enochian movement. And so if he's correct and Jesus and his disciples were deeply influenced by the Enochian texts, then I think that would favor them thinking that the soul is not intrinsically, that it cannot die, because that's not what we see within those other early Jewish texts.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, and you may already know what I'm going to mention because I mentioned to you. Thanks for inviting me to come. So I want to go back to Jesus' conflict with the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. And in Matthew's account, he specifically tells them that the problem is they don't understand the scriptures. And he uses his argument of saying, did not Moses say, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Do you think that all of these Jewish ideas, I mean, a lot of them may have been misunderstanding of the intentions of Scripture as inspired by God, and that if you properly read the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, then you see things like the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's very clear that but you also see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that there's an implied resurrection to eternal life or eternal judgment.
Right. So there is difficult because you get into terminology of what does resurrection mean and because with the terminology of resurrection, usually whenever scholars use that term, they're talking about a like bodily resurrection. There are other texts where people are spirits, but they aren't raised into a physical body, and so it is quite complicated. But for that particular text that you're mentioning, of where Jesus says, God is the God of the living and not of the dead, it's kind of, I have to look at it more closely because what gets translated as resurrection can also just mean literally to stand up or to rise, but it isn't really clear what is rising. Is it someone's physical body, or is it someone's spirit? So like it becomes like a giant mess about what do these people mean when they use this like terminology of being raised. But in that instance, I think that based upon what we know about the Sadducees, they didn't have any thinking about a positive afterlife or being raised within any sense. And so there, I think that Jesus might be talking about, oh, you are raised to this, to this blue category, or he could be talking about the final judgment in that text that you mentioned. So I have to look at it more closely because it gets really complicated. Anyone?
9:45, so we gotta call it there. But I'm sure Joshua will stick around if you want to talk to him a little bit more. I want to thank all of you for your time. I know this was extremely dense. Did it live up to the 4 at the top? Or was that an underrated? Okay, that's fine. If you go on the very back of your handout, you'll see, first of all, blank spot for all the notes that you could have written during the meeting. I forgot to mention that. But there's a link at the top if you want to download these slides. So let's thank our speaker again.
take this off.